Hello everyone, good afternoon from Bangkok. Thanks for joining this webinar today on Costing and Financing SDG 4, especially Target 4.2. This webinar is organized by UNESCO Bangkok with the support from the Korea Funding Trust. My name is Shu Tong. I'm a sponsored junior expert at UNESCO Bangkok. It is my great pleasure today to welcome you to this event. This webinar will run over 2 days. Today, we'll cover evidence-informed research on the importance of early childhood education and why member states should plan for investment in ECCE. We'll also be sharing regional and global costing models and financing mechanisms for SDG 4.2. Tomorrow, at the same time, we'll continue our discussion. We'll contextualize the information from day one with country case studies on the success and barriers for costing and financing ECCE. The purpose of this webinar is to strengthen national capacity, as well as to raise awareness on systematic planning for costing and financing SDG 4 policies and programs. We also aim to promote multilateral engagement and cooperation in ECC policies and programs in the Asia-Pacific region. Before we begin, please allow me to briefly go over the housekeeping rules. This webinar is being recorded for wider sharing later on, and occasional photos might be taken during the session. We welcome questions throughout this webinar. Please use the Q&A feature of Zoom, which is located at the bottom of your screen. Please also indicate the panelists. Please also indicate which panelists you would like to address the question to, unless it is a general comment or thought. And there's also a chat box function in Zoom. Our team will be monitoring the chat box during the session and will try to bring your input into the discussion. At the end of this webinar, participants will be directed to a short active survey. Please help us by completing a short evaluation form, which will take about 5 minutes. And finally, all of the webinar resources will be made available on the UNESCO webpage shortly after the event. We'll also post the link in the chat box for your information. With this, I would like to invite Mr. Shigeru Aoyagi, Director of UNESCO Bangkok, Asia Pacific Regional Bureau for Education, for his opening remarks. Mr. Aoyagi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Huton. Good afternoon, colleagues, speakers, and participants. I would like to extend, on behalf of UNESCO, my warm welcome to you all for our 2-day regional webinar on costing and financing SDG 4 on education, especially Target 4.2, Early Childhood Education and Care, ECCE. As the severe and persistent COVID-19 pandemic continues to impact our lives and the future of our children, it is of the highest importance for the government to not only maintain, but also to increase education funding at all levels in their national budgets. Given the impact of the pandemic on national economies, there is a risk of government decreasing education budgets, and one area that is at particular risk is ECCE. Research has shown that quality pre-primary services and investment in the early level lives of children provide significant educational, social, and economic benefits. Evidence shows that early learning not only positively impacts individuals throughout their primary and secondary schooling, but society at large. In fact, compared to other levels of education, investment in ECC programs can bring returns that far exceed their costs. Such high returns of this kind of investment occur largely in the period from a child's birth to about 5 years of age, especially for disadvantaged children. Despite this growing body of research, For many countries in Asia and the Pacific, the overall expenditure on ECCE as a percentage of GDP is generally falling far below international benchmarks. These benchmarks call for expenditure of at least 1% of the country's GDP and or at least 10% of public education expenditure. In past years, Asia-Pacific regional efforts and commitments have been made through the 2018 Kathmandu Statement of Action and the 2016 Putrajaya Declaration. It has been clearly stated that the inadequate understanding of costing of relevant interventions, along with poor financial approaches, prove to be major impediments to the proper integration of pre-primary education into education sector plan. This leads to a lack of policy intention and related resources to sustain and expand ECC programs in many countries. As we all know, collecting ECC data is not as straightforward as other levels of education. 3 years ago, during the third Asia-Pacific Regional Policy Forum on ECCE, it was shown that multi-sectoral nature of ECCE makes it difficult to collect and collate data from different ministries in charge of ECCE. The resulting lack of quality finance and expenditure data, especially on pre-primary education, disaggregated by different types of services and a variety of additional factors such as gender, income, age, race, ethnicity, language, migratory status, disability, and the geographic location, hinders costing and estimating financial gaps in education. This leads to a larger lack of understanding needed to formulate well-targeted approaches for disadvantaged children. To assist member states in properly planning and resourcing the education sector overall, Bangkok office, with financial support from the Funding Trust of the Republic of Korea, in short KFIT, has launched 2 interrelated projects to develop a costing simulation model that will help strengthen national capacities for systematic review and make possible the scientific analysis of costing and the financing for achieving SDG 4.1, 4.2, and 4.5. Under the framework of the KFIT projects, this 2-day webinar aims to, number 1, understand systematic planning for costing and financing for SDG 4, especially for quality early childhood policies and programs. Number 2, share recent global and regional developments on the systematic costing and financing of SDG 4, especially in the area of target 4.2. Number 3, share relevant regional and national ECCE, and lastly, catalyze multilateral engagement and cooperation for costing and financing ECC policies and programs in Asia and the Pacific. The webinar will feature 6 panel speakers covering global, regional, and national efforts to ensure the efficient use of resources invested in achieving SDG 4.2. UNESCO Bangkok, along with the new global partner strategy for ECCE, is committed to supporting member states' efforts in providing at least 1 year of compulsory quality pre-primary education by 2030. We hope this webinar will lend considerable regional momentum to establish strong implementation and financing mechanisms that will ensure greater efficiency and transparency in resource allocation and their utilization towards achieving this goal. Thank you everyone once again for joining this webinar. I look forward to hearing today's presentation from our expert speakers and learning from the insightful discussions that were sure to follow in the subsequent Q&A session. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Mr. Aoyagi. Now I have the pleasure to pass on the floor to my colleague, Ms. Kyung-Ah Christie Ben, Program Officer at UNESCO Bangkok. Christie will be monitoring the rest of the webinar. Over to you, Christie.
Thank you, Shutong, for your kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you once again for joining us today for this webinar on this important topic on costing and financing SDG 4, especially focusing on SDG 4.2. We have three very interesting presentations with us today that will introduce UNESCO's effort to support governments in costing and planning ECC sector by introducing different costing models and how it can be used to inform education policy planning at national, at regional, and global level. With this session, we hope to trigger conversations around cross-country and multi-level advocacy in support of increasing investment for early childhood care and education, which is very much needed at the moment. So the presentation, we will move from the national to regional and to the global level. So we have with us first, Ms. Diane Corey. Diane is working as an education program specialist at UNESCO IIP, supporting member states in the areas of strategic education plan preparation, monitoring and evaluation. Passionate about ECE, she has lately worked in close hands with the Ministry of Education in the Gambia to strengthen ECE into education planning by supporting key studies on the cost effectiveness of ECE models and on ECE financing. She has also worked at UNESCO Dakar and also UNICEF. Next, we have Mr. Masaya Noguchi. Masaya is a consultant at UNESCO Bangkok office, where he works in the section for inclusive quality education. Currently, he focuses on ECE, working on the projects that we mentioned. Through the project, he has been providing support on the development of the education costing and model. He also study at the moment at the Kobe University on ECC area. And then we will be hearing from Ms. Yuki Murakami. Yuki joined the Global Education Monitoring Report team in 2016 to work on education finance issues. Previously, she was a health economist at the OECD analyzing health expenditure, trends, and financing mechanism using the system of health accounts in both OECD and non-OECD countries. She was also at the World Bank for the Latin America and the Caribbean region, where she analyzed affordability of tertiary education and the cost and benefit of skilled labor migration, and served in a project to improve youth employment. So each speaker will have 20 minutes for the presentation, and we will open up the floor for the Q&A session. Please don't forget to use the Q&A function down below to send your questions. So warm welcome to all our speakers. With that, I would like to now invite Ms. Diane as our first speaker to start this her presentation. Over to you, Diane.
Thank you very much, Christy. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much also for the invitation. You will see that my presentation is not from a country based in Asia and Pacific region, but country from Africa. But we believe still that it will be insightful for you. So my presentation will be on funding equitable and high quality early childhood education in the Gambia. Indeed, it's a country that is located in West Africa. It's a low-income country, but we really think that the takeaway points, what we will be features in this presentation will still serve low-income countries in the region you are. So the rationale behind the study, actually, we conducted the study. The rationale started with the idea that there were a huge recognition today that many countries were facing huge challenges in adequately funding the scale up of their ECD subsector, especially in low-income countries where ECE would be actually the most needed. And among reasons that were identified, the lack of data on cost and financing has been recognized as a major problem. With limited data, it becomes very difficult to properly integrate ECE into education sector plans and thereby supporting adequate resource mobilization for the subsector. Funding the scale-up of pre-primary remains critical in the Gambia, a country that is really dedicated to expand ECE access, but which also operates in a very tight fiscal space. So the ministry in charge of education, that is called MOPSI there, and has collaborated with us to conduct two major studies on the cost effectiveness of early childhood education center models, as well as on the funding of ECE to generate robust and relevant evidence on ECE quality, cost and financing, this to adequately feed the policy dialogue around sustainable scale-up of quality ECE for all children in the country. Also today, as was mentioned earlier, with COVID-19, government expected to record a major drop in financial resources for education, including official development assistance. And ECE could be particularly affected by this drop. In this context, finding ways to build back better requires more than ever an understanding of where financial leeway stands. Next, please. So my presentation will be addressing four major questions. First, we will ask ourselves what was spent on ECE in 2018 in the Gambia, who was financing ECE, what is the prevailing ECE financing structure, and is the current ECE financing pattern equitable, efficient, and sustainable? Note that we will use the term ECE, pre-primary, preschool kind of interchangeably throughout the presentation. Next, please. So the work relied on a series of tools and methodologies that were already existing. Sorry. So there are three major guidelines we have been using. The major one was the education sector analysis guidelines that were developed a few years back. We also relied on the household education guidelines, also, well, spending that was also developed, this one by IAP Dakar. And we relied on the education national account guideline developed by various actors, including GPE, UAS, UNICEF, World Bank, and UNESCO. That's very important to understand that those guidelines exist, and it's very easy to customize them to our needs, so for the ECE sectors. So we have really tried not to reinvent the wheel, but really use what we had that were fully matching our needs. So the approach consisted mainly in mapping major ECE providers. Then for each providers, we have identified the financing sources and mechanisms. And then we have collected relevant data, consolidate them and analyze them. And what we will be presenting today is a portion of those analyses. We relied on a variety of data sources and information to be able to build this, the global funding going to ECE. One of the major sources was the Education Management Information System, the EMIS. We also relied on the actual budget data from the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Education. We also used the payroll from the Ministry of Public Service. We relied on donors report and as well from NGO and as well NGO report. We also used World Bank public expenditure reviews. Also, to be able to capture private financing, we have developed a dedicated survey to capture those data, and including from private providers, NGO providers, but as well from household. So we had conducted a kind of household survey. And last but not least, we had conducted a series of interviews with key informants, including Ministry of Education staff, Ministry of Finance, development partners, NGOs, as well as head teachers. Next, please. So what is the situation in the Gambia related to pre-primary education? So EC in the Gambia falls under the Ministry of Education. It is of 3 to 4 years duration, and as such, it targets children from 3 to 6. It is important to know that today it's not compulsory. As far as access is concerned, you can see on the figure on the left that enrollment has been increasing at all levels of education over the last decade, especially over the period from which we had data 2013-2019. And a major increase could be recorded in ECE with almost 18% percentage point increase. Also, we are facing a good situation with enrollment being on the rise. At the same time, we can see that the gross enrollment rate was only of 54% in 2019, suggesting that almost half of children are not actually participating in early childhood education. In addition, the subsector is facing major disparities, as you can see from the table on your right. Disparities related to location, to wealth, also here not shown to disability status. But on a good record, we could say that as far as gender is concerned, parity was reached for that subset. Next, please. Regarding EC provision, we have in the Gambia a variety of providers. There are 5 major types of EC provision. They are the private, government, madrasa. We also have community-based and mission ECD centers. Today, the private sector is really dominating the subsector with more than half of children enrolled in those institutions. The share of the government is around 25% and has been remaining at that magnitude over the last decade. Also, an interesting result or a worrying result that could be retrieved from the analysis that we have conducted in parallel that relates to the cost effectiveness analysis that assesses children early skills development at the end of preschool in the Gambia. We could assess that a very tiny share of kids, 4% of them were school ready, in the sense that they had the skills in terms of literacy, numeracy, social emotional skills, executive function skills that were meeting the standards for next, please. So concerning the financing of ECE, what we could see is that whether it was the financing structure in terms of sources and mechanism, both aspects were very diverse. And actually that's a common features we see in many countries. So the financing source consisted of public and non-public sources. Mainly we had government, we had households, other private entities that comprises NGOs, FBOs, proprietors, communities, and philanthropists. And it's a specific things in the Gambia. Philanthropists refer to those individuals that make private donation, such as so we are behind this term. So we have tourists, sorry, we have proprietors, relatives living abroad, or even local wealthy individuals. And also we have DPs, development partners. As far as financing mechanism is concerned, we have direct support to EC providers, upfront payment of all expenses, especially the case of the Ministry of Education. We have payment of user fees by households directly to service providers. So when service providers are those ECD centers. We have direct contribution in kind or in cash to service providers. For instance, when parents provide some food item for the school canteen, or when parents provide even, charcoal for the classroom. And we have transfers, for instance, from DPs to Ministry of Education budget, but also from the Ministry of Education to NGOs to support a certain cost item. Next, please. So what was spent on EC in the Gambia in 2018? So the total amount was roughly around $650 million, which is close to $14 million at that time, or close to 0.8% of GDP. As you can see from the graph on the right, the major funder was household that accounted for 67% of total spending, followed by the government at 11%. And then we had DPs at 8% and the other private accounting for 14% of total expenditure. Next, please. To reference of the different source of funding by ECD center type, we could see here from the graph that the private ECD center were extremely reliant on household, representing 82% of total funding of those ECD centers. You can see the bar, the blue bar, that really heavy as far as private center is concerned. This is in contrast to community, actually, where you have a much more balanced or different type of funding sources. At the same time, what is somehow concerning is that still for community-based, 50% of their expenditure or their funding is coming from household. And it is important to remember that household, community-based are actually targeting areas which are supposed to be the poorest. So here we are dealing with 50% of funding going from those households who are still the poorest. So you can see that there are still some kind of equity issues there. We have to be thinking when we will have in mind the idea of expanding those type of model. Is still a lot of bulk on the shoulders of those parents. With no surprise, government preschool has the greatest reliance on the government as a fund of sources, as the funding sources. Also, households still amounting for an important share of funding, amounting at 27% of the total government EC center finance. In the following slide, we will review each funding sources by highlighting some key features. Next, please. So we're going to start with public EC financing. You remember that so they are not the prime financer, they are the second financer at 11% of total funding going to the subsector. Within the education budget, so the lower basic and upper basic and secondary education budget, EC represents 4% of this total budget, which is very low if you compare to what goes for lower basic education, which is 43%. So lower basic is equal to primary education in the Gambia. So we have a huge disparity here, but there are reasons, of course. Also, with this level of percent, it's still not that bad if we compare to other countries in the region, and if we compare with the 2% that is often seen for the subsector in low-income countries. So this situation is a reflection actually of a very long-standing lack of specific focus of the government on ECE. But there are some evidence that the share of public funding going to ECE is on the rise if we account for the rising number of children being enrolled in those in government ICT centers, as well in grant-aided centers. Grant-aided are those centers that are supported by the government, for instance, many mission schools, and actually also some community-based centers where government, for instance, they pay directly the teacher salary. So this is good to see that there is a growing efforts made by the government by further supporting the subsector. Now, if we look at the little graph on the right that shows public unit cost, or the average recurrent spending per student per education level in 2018, we can infer from this graph that the share of spending going to ECE is partly related to the smaller enrollment at that level. You know, indeed, there are many less enrollment in ECE than in other subsectors. So at the end of the day, the share going to ECE is smaller. But from this, given the fact that the unit cost for ECE is much lower than the others, we can really infer that, yeah, the lower level of enrollment is one thing, but there are also an underfunding of this subsector. Okay, next. So now looking at the household pattern, as we have already outlined, households are really the principal funder of ECE in the Gambia, absorbing around 67% of total funding. We have presented here two graphs to highlight two features here. From the graph on the left, you will see that that is showing the relative contribution of households compared with the contribution of government. We can see two things. First, that the household relative contribution that is highlighted in blue in the graph is really much higher for early childhood education than for other subsectors. And that this contribution has increased over the years. If we look at the graph, the second bar that relates to ECE 2015, and we compare it with the first bar on the left that relates to ECE in 2018, what we can see is that in 2015, household contributed 77 Gambian dalasi towards ECE for every 23 Gambian dalasi poured by the government. In 2018, we have the ratio is 86 to 14. So this pattern makes it quite regressive as far as the ECE financing is concerned. And now if we look at the graph on the right, that displays household cost per child and by household wealth, with Q1 being the poorest household and Q4 the richest household, what we can see is that the financial constraints faced in particular by parents from poorer households is particularly harsh, as those households in Q1 were spending nearly half what those households in Q4, so the better off household, were spending on ECE for their child in 2018. What is also interesting is that looking by the disaggregating this pattern by activities or by item cost, we could see that food-related expenses occupied a disproportionate share of spending for most households. Also, it was a little bit more pronounced for households from the poorest quartile, and that the requirement for uniform and school clothing, as well as school-related fees, was putting further financial pressure on the poorest house. Next, please. So for now, if we look at the other private sources, They represent a major source of funding. They're around 14% of total EC funding in 2018. However, it is important to remember that those sources of funding are often one-off contribution, and as such, they cannot really be considered as a sustainable contribution over time. As far as the development partners is concerned, what we can see from the graph is that, I don't know if you can see that from the graph. Well, globally, what has happened actually is that this has increased over years. And such an increase is quite interesting because it could really be interpreted as a strong signal to the government of the importance that donors are putting into ECE. At the same time, it's important also to consider that this type of funding has also a series of limits. It is limited vis-a-vis ECE funding. Remember, it represents 8% of total ECE funding in 2018. It is also limited within the donor support. If you look here at the graph, you can see that, the table, sorry, that actually within donor spending, the Gambia, ECE represented, if we account, if we look at the last column, 7% of total spending, of donor spending was going to early childhood education, the big chunk going to primary education level. So you see that still it's on the rise, it's growing, but at the same time, it's still a little bit limited. And again, another major limit is that they are, most of the time, they are project driven. So they are not so much like budget support. And in the Gambia, we had very few actors involved. There were, we could really count them on the finger of one hand. They consisted first of the World Bank MTPE, then the World Food Program with their school feeding program activities, and UNICEF. Next. So I'm going to conclude, and I would like perhaps to give you some key points for you to take, and I'm going to highlight them. First, it's interesting to know that in the Gambia, the country has achieved relatively high EC coverage with very little government financial support. At the same time, this was feasible following disproportionate reliance on household financing, which raised major important equity issues, while also questioning the sustainability of such a financing pattern over the long run. Low levels of school readiness among preschoolers that we have identified in the cost effectiveness analysis is also questioning the effectiveness of current ECE policies implementation, as well as the efficient use of resources. Indeed, when only 4% of kids are ending to be school ready, you can imagine all that money that is poured into the system by parents, by government, by even, we have seen all the private entities, that leads to so little results. So it's really questioning, and it's quite alarming. And there is a real need to rethink how this current services are financed and where the resources are going, because right now it's not producing the result. But also it highlights these issues. A major issue is that today the sector is heavily underfinanced. So indeed, at the same time, if you don't pour the right level of resources, you cannot imagine having the right level of quality at the end of the day. So in this context, for the Gambia to build better, there will be both a requirement to increase ECE funding. And I think colleagues in their presentation, we also better highlight what type of increase is needed for a specific context and regional and national context. But also there is a need to support more cost-effective intervention. that bring the quality at lower cost or optimized quality for a certain level of investment. And also it will be very important to ensure that the most vulnerable are not left behind. So there are various ways of increasing ESF funding that needs to be developed. There is a need to increase public funding from the public sources, and also to rely on alternative financing mechanisms. And actually in the Gambia, it's quite interesting because the scale of the private sector provide very interesting opportunities for the subsectors to establish public-private partnership, and really for the public resources to leverage more private funding. However, it will be important, again, as I just mentioned, to secure the most vulnerable, most disadvantaged population. And as such, it is very important that the public sector remains. It's important also to remember that ECE should be considered as a public good, and as such should receive adequate public funding priority. The recommendation of this analysis that we have not proposed to show here, but as well along those that we have also formulated in the cost effectiveness analysis to be useful, they would need to be analyzed using simulation model, and that's what the colleagues will be showing just after me, to see the implication, financial implication of those policies, but also as well to discuss the technical and human feasibility. So simulation models are very interesting tools for that, and also to create consensus about how to move together as multi-partners together to move forward and expand the EC subsector in a sustainable and equitable way. A last point I would like to make is that data collection would be critical for proper planning, budgeting, and monitoring processes, and for really adequately advocate for the subsector financing increases. Indeed, data collection has been quite a challenge when we have conducted this exercise. Data on ECE, including ECE financing, has proven to be not centralized. They are scattered across different ministries, across different sources. And actually the information happened to be often patchy and incomplete, and was found at many times to be inconsistent across sources. And so we had to do many checks, many data checks, many data triangulation to try to come up with robust results. And at national, it is this type of data you will need to have in order to feed your simulation model. So they are very important for many different areas. And that's the point that we would like also to make. It's really important for governments to put lots of attention to data and strengthen existing data information system to really support adequate expansion of the subsector lately. Thank you very much. I'm done. Thanks. Oh, by the way, so if you want to see we have done a small 8-pager related to this study. You can find it on this website. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane, for your very informative presentation, sharing experience from Gambia. It is again interesting to see different key stakeholders financing ECE in Gambia context. The equity issue and the high burdens of household spending on ECE Gambia is also happening in many countries in the Asia Pacific region. So I think there are a lot of learning that we can learn from the Gambia. I would like to now invite Mr. Masaya for his presentation on regional costing model on SDG 4.1, 4.2, and 4.5. Masaya, the floor is yours.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yes.
So thank you very much for your kind introduction, Christy. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. A very warm greeting to everyone where you might be connecting to this webinar today. My name is Masaya Noguchi, consultant of the section for inclusive quality education in UNESCO Bangkok. And thank you very much again for joining this workshop today. The title of my presentation is the Regional Model on Costing SDG 4, Asia and the Pacific. The presentation has three parts. First, just to summarize the current situation of education finance in the Asian Pacific region and see whether this trend is sufficient or not to achieve SDG 4. Second, overview of regional effort for education finance in these regions and the key outcome of UNESCO and the KFIT project. I will introduce you the regional cost model. Third, I will show you the some analysis on the education cost and the finance and summarize how to utilize this kind of costing estimation tool for the policy development. I believe the majority of the audience might think investment in education is important to ensure equitable access to education or to improve the quality of education. But as you can see in the left figure, also government spending to education for these measures by the percentage of GDP has been increased at the global level. That of Central and South Asia highlighted in red, and that of Eastern and Southeast Asia in the orange are quite low level compared to other regions. In addition, when looking at the government education expenditures measured by as a share of total public expenditure, that of Eastern and South Asia is the lowest level. In the Education 2013 framework for action, there is an international benchmark about government education and finance to allocate at least 4% of GDP and or at least 50% of public expenditure to education. However, Asian sub-regions did not meet both of two international benchmarks. This graph shows government education expenditures in the Asian Pacific regions. As you can see, only 9 countries out of 48 countries in these regions reach the international benchmark, and almost half countries are under the two benchmarks. Then with this current situation of education finance in these regions, we could see the education expenditure in this region has not been adequate. In order to address the financial issues and to make regional cooperation to achieve SDG 4 at the regional level, UNESCO Bangkok, together with our partners, have conducted some projects for adequate and efficient education finance in this region under 3 pillars, which are to develop methodology guidelines and 2 for costing and financing of SDG 4, then to provide the technical support and the capacity development on costing and financing of SDG 4, and to contribute to the midterm progress review and the regional policy forums. As a first category key outcome, UNESCO Bangkok has developed a regional costing model and for the Asian and Pacific countries. Before introducing our regional costing model, let me briefly explain what is the education simulation model and what is the differences among other existing costing tools. Education simulation model was introduced since 1916 by the UNESCO and the other international organizations as a tool in process to support education system around the world. A simulation model generally aims to simulate the reality by estimating and assessing the future circumstance based on the change in the given variable. Also, the simulation model take a policy option, technical feasibility, and the financial constraints into account in order to project future resourcing and budgeting needs that would serve as the basis for policy dialogue. Then this framework summarizes the process of the simulation of a costing model. So when we want to do expenditure projections, then we can start to set the target related to access to education, such as the gross enrollment rate, repetition rate, and the dropout rate. Then with actual data of population and the set target, we can estimate the number of projected enrollment. Then with those numbers, then we can analyze the required number of human and physical resources by setting targets such as the student-teacher ratio, student classroom ratio, distribution of public school, or number of learning materials per student. Then after the finding required number of those resources, then we can calculate the cost for teachers, other staff, equipment, and the facilities with a unit cost if there is actual data or with some assumption data. Then by comparing estimated cost and the project domestic resources, then we can finally see the funding gap. The regional costing model that I will introduce is a kind of a hybrid version of the previous costing models developed by UNESCO and other international organizations. Each model have a specific concept and objective for development. For example, there were some models that estimate education cost at the global level, while others do projection at the country levels by considering very specific conditions and taking into account the government-specific policies. Then in Asian Pacific region, the previous regional model, which is ESCAP model, is mainly for analyzing cost and finance at the sub-regional level. Then with applying methodology as a previous model developed, the latest Asian Pacific regional costing model has been developed with support from KFIT. Based on the methodology we use for the model development, the ECE costing and the financing model has also been developed. About this model, specialized for ECE subsections, Ms. Christie will explain more details tomorrow. This UNESCO regional education costing model for Asian and the Pacific region is, as I mentioned, it's a revised and improved version of the previous model that UNESCO and ESCAP developed. The main purpose of this model is to estimate the cost to achieve SDG 4 target in the Asian Pacific region, specifically SDG 4 target 4.1 for universal primary and secondary education, and 4.2 for universal pre-primary education, and 4.5 for gender equality and inclusion. It also aims to be advocacy and capacity development tool to support those listed 48 countries in this region to understand and meet the financial commitment for the national and international education goals. Here are some key advantages of the model. First, with updated data and the newly available indicator, estimation results are useful to estimate total cost of all types of education, as well as expenditure per student. The best thing about this model is that it takes some key global and thematic SDG 4 indicators into account. Second, since this model applies a country-specific approach, this model can trace and summarize the historical data from 2008 to 2020 about education attainment and the implementations by using the quality data set. Tracing historical data will be very useful to assess the overall educational progress as a part of the 5-year progress review on SDG 4 in this region. Third, by using 63 scenarios and the 5 key categories, including scenario for pre-primary education, primary education, secondary education, post-secondary education, and some economic variable, the user can take into account the specificities of the given national education system and the educational targets and estimate the educational cost for the various situations. These are the scenarios used for the model estimations that we can set the access target, specific target for each education level, such as a percentage of children who are enrolled in the private institutions, pupil-teacher ratio, and the additional cost for marginalized children. Also, the user can control some economic variable, including GDP growth, government education expenditures, and household contribution. In addition to the pre-COVID-19 projection system, the model includes a function to estimate the financial impact of COVID-19 on education at the regional, sub-regional, and the country level by applying and redesigning the UNESCO's headquarters methodology. The COVID-19 pandemic has led to the school closure in the more than 118 countries, affecting more than 1 billion students and learners since last year. It also poses unprecedented challenges for education finance throughout the world. We actually did not know how much money we need to continue or increase the quality inclusive education during this crisis. Some key elements such as the impact of COVID-19 on GDP growth, the possible changes to domestic allocation of funds to education, change in the official development assistance, and the additional costs for the quantile and the remediation measures need to be considered, and those scenarios developed by the headquarters are applied for this regional model. Those are the brief introductions of the regional costing model for Asia and Pacific. From this section, I will show the sum estimation result to answer the following 4 questions to introduce how the costing tool can be utilized for the policy development at multi-level. First question is how much would it cost to achieve universal access to education in the Asia and Pacific? Second question is how much will the government need to increase education expenditure to provide a free education from pre-primary to secondary education in Southeast Asia? Third question is how much would it cost to improve the student-teacher interactions in Philippines? Then final question is how much would it additionally cost to address COVID-19 measures in Philippines? Before presenting the estimation result, please make sure that the number I will show from now will be changes depending on the scenario setting and the policy interest. So those results can be used as references for comparing other scenarios or policy setting for the further estimations. Then for the first question, to see the financial requirement to achieve universal access to education from pre-primary education to upper secondary in the Asia and Pacific, then confirm that the all access target for the full education level are 100%. The left figure shows the projected enrollment ratio to achieve 100% by 2013. To achieve this access target in this region, the number of required teacher, school building, learning materials, and the other some administrative costs will be increased accordingly. Then in total, the estimation results show the 800 to 9.5 billion US dollar will be required in 2013 with this scenario. So by focusing on the result by sub-region and education level, then the cost in East and the Northeast Asia and the cost for the primary education are dominant as shown in the right graphics. Then next one is to answer how much would the government need to increase the financial expenditures to provide a free education from pre-primary to secondary in the Southeast Asia at the sub-regional level estimation. The left figure shows the financial requirement to achieve universal access to education from pre-primary to upper secondary in 2024 and 2013 by the country in Southeast Asia. Of course, in every country, the costs were increased from 2024 to 2013. Then what we want to see is how will the government increase education expenditure for providing free education. In original scenario setting, that we control their contribution from household, but to set the situation that the government provide free education, we can very simply assume there were no household contribution. Then here is the result. To provide free education from pre-primary to upper secondary, the government needs to scale up its educational expenditure to compensate decrease in revenue from a household. So at South Asian sub-region level average, the 7.5% of GDP at least need to be spent for education to achieve providing a free education with all children in this sub-region. The third question is estimation at the national level. That's how much would it cost to improve the student-teacher interactions in the Philippines. In this scenario setting, we assume that lower student-teacher ratio can contribute to improve the student-teacher interaction, which leading to improve the quality of education itself. So we compare the two scenario 1 and 2. Every student-teacher ratio in scenario 2 are lower than that in scenario 1. To decrease the student-teacher ratio in accordance with the increased number of student enrollment, it is obvious that we need more teachers. So the left figure shows the integrated number of required teachers to achieve scenario 1 and scenario 2. Then as you can see, actually there are more required teachers in section 2. If the number of teachers are increased, the recurrent cost for salary and some training will also be increased. The estimation results show the cost will be increased at the 18.7% by the changing scenario from 1 to scenario 2. The first question is how much would it additionally cost to address COVID-19 measures in the Philippines? There were 4 key categories of the additional cost for COVID-19 measures, which are the enrollment cost, learning loss cost, the participation reduction, and the additional cost. The re-enrollment costs include the cost to provide a campaign and the target interventions to return all students back to school. The learning loss costs include the cost of remediation to compensate learning loss. The participation reduction costs include the cost for providing students those who dropped out of general education with second chance education. Then additional classroom costs include the cost to buy the additional sanitation equipment. Then the table shows the estimation result of additional costs to address the COVID-19 measures. The integrated additional cost from 2020 to 2013 will be the $11,483.5 million US, which is around 70% of the cost of pre-COVID-19 projects. But this amount will be increased if providing remote learning devices considered, and the UNESCO team has been gathering actual data and developing this estimation methodology to see the result at the regional level and the sub-regional level. So by using 4 different policy settings, that I demonstrated how to use a regional cost model and to analyze the estimation results. As I shown, that one of the good characteristics of this model is to estimate the financial requirement at the regional level, sub-regional level, and the national level. And the model can develop into a powerful operational tool for designing elaborated education development plan that can be taken into account the specificities of the given international and the national access and the quality education target and some economic conditions. But to improve the quality of education, we need accurate historical data about populations, enrollment, school flow, resource for schools, budget, and macroeconomic variables. Although the data can be gained from US data sources, national report, and other respective education databases, the strengthening the data management capacity is very essential. Otherwise, the quality of estimation will be decreased. But with the actual and the scenario which following international and national targets, the estimation results will be key evidence for the further policy development. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your great attention. Back to you, Christy.
Thank you, Masaya, for sharing the regional costing model. It highlights how different data are used to make different projection simulations to reach SDG 4 targets. And it was useful to see how the model was adapted to show the estimate financial impact of COVID-19. Please feel free to add your questions on Q&A box. I know there are a lot of information to digest, but if you have any comments and questions, please feel free to add. And all webinar material will be available on our website. Next, I would like to now invite our last speaker, Ms. Yuki, for her presentation covering the global level effort. Yuki, over to you.
Thank you so much, Christy, and thank you so much for the kind introduction. And I'm just pleased to be here. Hello, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or good evening for those who are here in this seminar. So I'm presenting today the, Christy, would you mind sharing the slide, please? Yeah, thank you so much. And the next one, please. Thanks. So I'm presenting today the costing model from the global perspective, focusing on low and lower middle income countries. So as you have seen, that the first, the DIANS was about the country specific, and the Messiah being focusing on Asia Pacific. Now my focus is a little bit more global, but with the special attention to low and lower middle income countries. This was made to set the stage for SDG for education costing exercises. And here today, I'm going to present the slides more with a focus on pre-primary at the global level. And I will discuss the model outcomes and the financing policy implications on pre-primary education in low and middle income countries. So just so that there is a little context before that, so there's a little historical work before this 2020 exercise on a global education costing model, that previously in 2015, my team, the Global Education Monitoring Team, estimated the cost of achieving the headline SDG 4 targets, which is to ensuring universal pre-primary, primary, and secondary education of good quality by 2030 in low and lower mid-income countries. And the results show the cost would be an accumulative of $5.1 trillion US, which is, it's a little bit hard to imagine how much the cost is, but equivalent to about like $340 billion per year between 2015 and 2030. So out of which the 301 billion, I'm going to go more in detail, but just wanted to give a little context. Out of which 301 billion need to be covered by government, and I mean will be covered by government and the ODA or foreign assistance. And then the remaining 39 billion per year was left as a financing gap. So since 5 years, since the initial model or 2015 model, last year in 2020, the GEM report updated the data in the model and then checked whether the assumption made in 2015 had been proven accurate or if there's any progress since then. So the focus on low-income countries or lower middle-income countries remain the same. So for this particular seminar, so perhaps you already seen from the previous slide that the presentation that for the Asia and Pacific, we have several countries, I mean, quite a few countries, including Bangladesh, Bhutan, Cambodia, Kiribati, Tajikistan, and so on. Next slide, please. So just to recap what we have learned so far, that in terms of the pre-primary, the SDG goals have set a very ambitious target for many countries. And by 2030, all people, I mean, for pre-primary education, the target has assumed that all children will complete at least 1 year of a pre-primary. And this does not mean that even though some countries already have compulsory education for pre-primary, and it may actually last more than 1 year, in terms of the costing exercise, we just said, this is only for 1 year to see, because some of those other countries actually do not meet the compulsory education yet, or the targets had not been made. So the main assumption is the pre-primary gross enrollment ratio would increase up to and reach 100% by 2030. And as you probably expect, that the benchmark GER, the gross enrollment rate in 2015, was about on average 35% for all the countries in the model. It was 25% for low-income countries and 42% for middle-income countries. So these rates would gradually increase up to by 2030. And another important assumption that was, because it's based on a unit cost costing, unit cost costing. The pupil teacher ratios would have to fall as countries become wealthier, which is according to the IMF's economic projections, and it assumes that the countries gradually converge and reach at least 20, no more than 20 pupils per teacher. And this ratio would grow, coverage would go meet or converge at the global average over time. So, and in general, the model also assumed that in 2015, the GDP growth rate was assumed at the 5% at the annual basis. However, this 2020 model, we replaced that with the actual IMF growth trajectory up to 2026. And we also calculated the growth rate from 2027 to 2030. And the GDP, and this was because the GDP on a lower middle income countries had grown on an annual basis, at least for 2016, 2019, the growth has actually fallen below the target, mostly in low income countries. And the GDP rising only at the average of 3.7%. So in the updated model, GDP projections has been updated based on that. And the model itself also uses a little bit of tax ratio, the tax ratio as a share of GDP to calculate the available budget on education. This scenario, at least for the 2020 update, we kept that ratios, which would increase but at the declining rate, and then calculated to estimate the education budget as a share of total budget. And then as we also have an investment cost, so the classroom construction cost would increase as we need, because a teacher, at least there's one class per teacher. So the classroom construction cost would be incorporating that. Next slide, please. So first, I'm going to show you two main factors that influence the costing. The projected number of pupils have slightly increased because of the population projection that has increased in the last 5 years. So in other words, that the population is still growing in low-income countries and lower-income countries, and that would affect the number of pupils who will be in the pre-primary education. And this would, just wanted to point out that this excludes those who are educated in the private education, private schools in elementary, in the pre-primary level. And these people who are financed out of pocket or be in a private education, they will be absorbed over years by the public education system or public budget. So that's one of the reasons why you see a rapid increase. So to show you the charts or the figures, that there were 19 million pupils in low middle income countries and 8.6 million pupils in low income countries in primary in 2015, and this actually doubled in 2025 and then tripled by 2030, reaching 58 million in lower middle income countries and 29 million pupils in low-income countries. And because of that, the PTR ratio mentioned in the previous slide, per pupil cost also increased significantly from 2015 and 2030. And this is even further so because there was not enough progress in terms of the availability of teachers, so PTR, in pre-primary in the last 5 years. So that the per pupil cost was $400 US in 2015 on average among all the countries in the study, but it actually went up to $1,000 US by 2030. This is in constant values. In the case of low income countries, initially it was less than $200 US in 2015. However, it actually increased by double and twice in 2025, and by 2030, it reached to $600 US, and more than triple the cost in 2015. And for lower middle income countries, it also doubled from $473 US in 2015 and to $645 US in 2020, and up to over $1,000 US in 2030. So just so now, the comparing to other levels of education, actually pre-primary ratio improved a lot in the last 5 years, which means that although many countries did not improve per se overall, the target, the movement in terms of the pupil and the teacher ratio have been faster than expected, at least for the pre-primary. But for example, the PTR ratio in pre-primary was 55% lower in South Asia. So it went from 31 per person or 31 per pupil to 14 per pupil during that time. So that's really a significant change. Next slide, please. So the cost of universal 1 year pre-primary is estimated at US $30 billion over the 15 years, which increased from $6 million US in 2015 to $75 million US in 2030. Sorry, yes. And the US $30 billion accounted for 7% of the total education costs, which actually is 6 times the pre-primary cost of 2012. And a financing gap between 2015 and 2030, it was 0.4% of the GDP in 2015 for all countries. And for lower income countries, it was 0.6% of the GDP in 2050. GDP, and for lower income country, it was 0.6% as the financing gap. And then for lower middle income countries, it was 0.2% overall as a share of GDP. So the total budget accounted so far is 0.1% of the national budget. And then the lower income countries being lower 0.2% of lower middle income countries. And the increase really reflects a combination of both the greater number of pupils, so 5 times more students in pre-primary and also upper secondary education in low income countries, and a higher per student cost, which were mainly mostly the result of decline or reducing or the falling pupil teacher ratios in pre-primary and higher teacher ratios at the pre-primary and primary levels. Next slide, please. So focusing on even a bigger picture. So thinking about all the levels of education. Since the 2015 model, over the last 5 years, investments have been made in education, but not fast enough or not large enough to maintain or reduce the yearly financing need to reach SDG 4 goals by 2030. So for instance, the ultimate secondary completion rate have very increased from 18% in 2015 to 20% in 2020. In the 2015 model, this was already assumed to reach 46% by now. So you see the progress has been half than we expected or we hoped that had been. So between 2015 and 2020, before the onset, so now we're talking a little bit about the COVID because we're still in the pandemic. The cumulative financing need to achieve SDG 4 by 2030 in low and lower middle income countries have remained the same, at just about $5 trillion US, which I mentioned earlier. But given the shorter time horizon to achieve those targets, obviously the annual financing need had increased from the $340 billion US per year to $504 billion US per year. So these figures you see on the two red bars, the one in the circles are an annual financing need. And the one below those figures are the total amount of financing need. And then those basically divided by 15 years, or 10 years, sorry, 10 years for the bottom, because this one only looking at the 2020 to 2030, and then above is looking at between 2015 and 2030. So comparing the model between 2015 model and then our update in 2020 on the bottom. So unfortunately, the cost became more than 2.2 times higher than the annual total cost at the time in the original model 2015 was calculated. And in our 2020 update, it is estimated at $3.6 trillion US would need to be invested between 2020 and 2030 to reach those SDG 4 goals. This would mean that this would translate over 10 years into a yearly average of 356 billion. And out of that 356 billion US, only 277 could be covered by the government budget and ODA, and the government or the financial gap remains at 148 billion US. So because these numbers don't really make sense sometimes if it is too global. So in relative terms, the total education cost would have to increase from 3.5% on average to 6.3% of GDP between 2015 and 2030. And obviously the increase is steeper in low-income countries because of the cost being tripled, both in terms of the cost and in terms of the volume, so number of pupils. Next slide, please. So this will be my last slide. So the key messages are basically to sum it up, our study, the notable factor accounted for the increased total financing gap relative to the estimate in 2015. And some important indicators such as the enrollment, completion indicators have only slightly increased since 2015. And the same targets now need to be achieved not only over 15 years at the time, but now in a compressed 10-year time frame. So the results indicated that, however, towards SDG 4 targets have been slow. If the cost is still to be achieved, the cost can be the annual cost. Sorry, the target has been slow and annual costs are rising. Moreover, the financing gaps come at the moment when the COVID-19 hit education systems. heavily in low and middle income countries. And COVID-19 adds even more expenses to the SDG ambition unless governments act quickly and invest wisely in order to avert the worst of the damage. We're talking about the learning gap and lost generation. And with that, I'm going to close my presentations, and thank you so much for your attention. And this report has been published as a policy paper in the JAM report, and I'll be happy to share. Also, just so you know that we are in the process of adding different components in the costing model. One is the household spending, so out-of-pocket spending on education for all the education levels. And we also costed the tertiary education level to give a complete picture of the education, to inform the policy makers. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Yuki, for your comprehensive presentation. It is quite alarming to see the increasing financial gap to reach SDG 4. And in order to reach SDG 4.2 and other SDG 4 targets, I think we really need to act now to increase investment for inclusive and quality CE. Now I would like to open the floor for question and answer. I see 2 questions on the Q&A box and 1 raised hand. I think the first question is to Diane. Why is WFP funding being excluded from the study? And the second question, is there any costing model for SDG 4.7? If yes, would you mind sharing the source where we can get further detail? And I think Miss Sonia, do you want to speak, raise your question? Okay, maybe we can go with the DN responding to the first question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that question. Actually, WFP data was available for 2018, the year where we conducted the exercise. To us, we had to choose 1 year where all data would. It's not that one. The latest year where we could get actually actual budget data from the Ministry of Finance, because you know that there might be difference between actual and voted budget. So that's why it's very important in those exercises to work with actual. So in our case, it was 2018. And we have tried to gather the information from all stakeholders, all donors, and to look at retrospectives for 2018, because it was the year of focus, we could get data from WFP for that year and for other donors as UNICEF, World Bank, through different sources, actually directly from the donor or through the Ministry of Finance, through the financing management information system. As far as WFP was concerned, we could not get trend data. That's why it was not shown as a trend. But for 2018, we could get all data. That is why you have on the table without and with WFP, in order to somehow show some trend and show the kind of accurate or the global or the more comprehensive figures for the year where we have been conducting the activity. It's important to remember that actually when we started the activity, it was before COVID-19 struck, and then we were caught into the pandemic, and we had started to complete the work distance, which made the work much more difficult. And that's why at some point we had to give up to say, okay, where do we stop? And it's where we have decided it was so complex to get WFP data over the longer trend period that, okay, fine, we do with what we have. That's why. And that's interesting because that's one of the major issues we see is that also, and that's the case I was pointing at the end of the presentation, the lack of consistent data at ministry level. So you have to go and discuss with different partners to get the overall picture. So still the ministry is working on an integrated financial management information system, but it's still not there.
Thank you, Diane. So we received 2 more questions to Diane, and I think the name is misspelled. Do you have any example of successful conditional cash transfer program that improves ECE, gross enrollment ratio, and school readiness? To Masaya, please could you explain how you allocate the COVID-19 across years? Do the increased costs run all the way through to 2030, or do they end once the pandemic is expected to ease? Do you make this assumption, and are the learning losses caught up before 2030?
So I'm going perhaps to disappoint the person who has the question around the conditional cash transfers. Actually, I don't really know any of those the subgroup I'm working with, but I know that there have been initiatives in South Africa, and I think UNICEF has been dealing with such type of mechanism. As far as the Gambia is concerned, what was interesting is that actually what was really successful in supporting learning was the school canteen. It's another form of transfers, if you want, because indeed you provide the food. And that was one, when we conduct the cost effectiveness analysis, it was the most important factor positively impacting learning along training, initial training. So that was a very interesting result, because that was a policy that the Gambia has decided to promote school feeding program with WFP, with also the idea of phasing it out WFP presence. And also, but another issue with even with cash transfer or school canteen is that they are pretty expensive, really. So it's interesting to see to what extent, in the case of the Gambia, there is a very reflection on how to provide more cost-effective intervention, relying less perhaps on external perhaps food, see to what extent food can be bought locally, which also reduce the cost of transport, which are huge, because when it comes from the sun, also Gambia is small, but still you have coming from the capital city and then going to each school. So there are some, that's why actually the exercise of also conducting parallel studies on what is positively impacting early learning is helpful when also modeling school expansion and funding, because indeed those social spending can be very critical in terms of they can be effective, and it's important to assess the cost if we want to go to scale.
Thank you, Diane. Over to Masaya on the question on COVID-19 projection.
Okay, so thank you very much for the very nice question. Yes, in the cost model that we are developing now, that we set the 3 periods to see the trend of the COVID-19 that include the epidemic period, the mediation period, and the post-pandemic pandemic. Then in the epidemic periods, that's like the close all schools or the most students are affected by this kind of COVID-19 issues. Then the mediation period means the students gradually come back to the school to the more normal situation. The post-pandemic situation is estimated by there were 10 years from 2020 to 2013, so it's 10 years. Then if we set the 2 years for the academic period, then we set estimate the assumption that the length of the mediation period will be the 2 times of the epidemic period, then will be the 4 years. So 2 years and 4 years will be the 6 years. So the 4 years will be the post-pandemic period. So by changing those periods, we set the different assumptions or set some cost target, then see the trend of how the COVID-19 affected not only just the next 2 years, but also in the next 10 years. So that's my answer.
Thank you, Masaya. Just to add to Diane's response, UNESCO Bangkok developed a regional guideline on innovative financing mechanism and partnership for ECCE. And part of our guideline, we also documented a successful conditional cash transfer program in Mexico and Mongolia. So I will leave the link on the chat so you can read further on that. There's one comment on the chat box mentioning there is significant difference between conditional cash transfer and school meal. We believe with the relation to the WFP intervention, school meal is critical for securing the at least 30% of calories intake need and 50% of micronutrition intake need of the age-specific needs of the children. We take note on this point. Any other questions from the floor? No? Then we have questions to all of you. Job, can you feature the Jamboard to the screen? So we have 3 questions that we want to get feedback and comments from all of you. And we will be using the Jamboard to collect your feedback. The 3 questions that we want to ask you is, first, what would be the major challenges for developing and sustaining a costing model for ECCE and how UNESCO can best support to it if your country is interested in. The second, there are many stakeholders in ECE sector, as many speakers mentioned. What would be the proposed mechanism to set up a country team to develop a costing model for ECCE? And the last one, the COVID-19 pandemic is greatly affecting all aspects of the ECE sector, including the availability of funding for the sector. If you were to estimate a project for future planning of ECE sector, do you think which indicators, parameters are useful to project and why? Job, can you share the link on the chat box for participants to access? So if you click the link on the chat box, you will be guided to the Jamboard. People without the Gmail account can also access. You can see when you click the link, go to the second slide. Job, can you go to the second slide? No, don't press the set background. Go to the second, yeah. So you can click this post-it icon on the left side below the arrow button to click and then enter your comments. So I can see one comment added, lack of government commitment as one of the challenge that participants added. So we would like to give you some time to go through the questions and then leave your responses on the Jamboard so that we can hear from you. And once you answer the question, you can go to the next slide and answer the second and then third questions. Please don't press the set background because it deletes all the information. So you only have to click the post-it notes to leave your comments. Okay. So while people are adding the comments, there's additional comments on the WASH data. Either Masaya or Yuki can answer the WASH data, where we get the WASH data and how it can be used in the costing model. That would be great. Yuki, do you want to go first?
Hi, yes. So the COVID model, the GEM report actually also calculated, or the UNESCO calculated the COVID model at the global level. And at the time we contacted the UNICEF colleagues. And UNICEF colleagues, basically, we contacted a lot of UNICEF colleagues, and we got hold of the data from Kenya, Liberia, the Philippines, Guatemala, and so on, Uganda, Bangladesh. And we basically calculated the cost of, let's say, different components like maintenance cost, so general repairs, the cleaning or the latrine, pit emptying, buckets, bathrooms, hand washing tabs, and stuff like that. We use the very detailed costing information from those countries, and then imputed it for the countries of the interest at the time. And this is so this is one-time cost. So from the latest data between like 2016 to 2019. So that's where the resources come from. Masaya, would you like to add in something?
Oh, thank you very much. Nothing to add from my side.
Okay, and I also see another raised hand from Sonia. Sonia, do you have a question this time, or? Okay, maybe you pressed the button wrong again. Maybe. Okay, going back to the Jamboard. I think people are starting to get familiar with the Jamboard and adding the comments. So the first question for the barriers and challenges for developing and sustaining costing model, we see lack of national level expertise in planning and monitoring, nationwide cascading and deliberation for the operationalization of the ECCE costing model, since the national ECC policymaking body do not have direct mandate and counterparts at the local government units. Disparity between various types of school, and the lack of data from the household and the low government expenditure on ECE, inadequate financing, collection of data. I think the data is a big part of the challenge, especially for this sector. As Diane mentioned, there are many different ministries involved in this ECCE sector, and also there, as mentioned on the comments, there are many different types of schools. So it's really hard to collect all the data, especially on the financing of this ECC sector. So I think it's a big issue. Need transparency in finance distribution to various agencies. Yes, I think that's why sometimes it gets very sensitive to get the data on finance. Costing of intersectoral approach to ECCD and lack of disaggregated data. Yes, I think the first point is also related to our second question. Let me move to the second question. There are many stakeholders in CC sector. What would be the proposed mechanism to set up a country team? The multi-sectoral coordination body, a committee need to be formed, include all the relevant ministries along the finance ministries. So I think it would be key to include the finance ministry in this multi-sectoral group. Establish a working group and engage all stakeholders. It's quite small. Having a country team combining Ministry of Primary and Mass Education, Ministry of Women and Children and Women Affairs. So I guess it means all the stakeholders have to be included in this multi-sectoral team to work together to work on this. And I think it's maybe Bangladesh specific comments. I'm just assuming based on the ministry's level. So I think we really have to work on multi-sector approach to project and cost multi-sectoral ECD, ECE. But yeah, I think it's a long way forward that we need to work together on this. The last question on COVID-19 pandemic and the future projection work. So I think participants found useful and helpful to have a projection on number of children in specific ages, data on children left behind and learning gaps among children in order to provide adequately for all children. Mapping of the services, review of development appropriate practice, review mapping and support to human resource development, teacher salary, operational investment, acceptance and broader understanding of families, parents towards the significance of ECE in human development, support for enhancing parental skills to facilitate early learning and responsive and protective parenting, developmental milestones of 0 to 8 years old children in varying contexts, mapping of presence of governments, CSO, NGOs in the area, and readiness of ECCD service providers and support system. We take note on this parameters and indicators and see how our costing model can accommodate these specific groups and targets. You can keep on adding your comments, but I think it's time for me to turn the floor to Shutong. Thank you everyone for joining today's panel session. I think I learned a lot. It was very number rich, a lot to digest. But I think it was very useful and relevant to our work. Shutong, I'm turning the floor over to you.
Thanks to all the speakers for your excellent presentations today, and thanks to all the participants for staying with us and for your active engagement. Tomorrow at the same time, we'll continue our webinar, And we'll be highlighting the country experience from Korea and Uzbekistan on their experience on costing and financing ECCE, as well as the lessons learned. So please stay tuned, and we look forward to welcoming you again tomorrow. Thank you.